So alongside all the faction changes for the new 40k balanced data slate, there's also rather a lot of changes and clarifications to the core rules of the game. Let's talk through all this errata and FAQs bit by bit in the latest rules patch for 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where the balanced data slate has certainly shaken up 40k. Perhaps the biggest and most impactful things will be the rules and points changes to the factions in question, though as I mentioned in numerous previous videos, I was hoping that Games Workshop would do an FAQ roundup with answering a bunch of questions that really needed basic fixes, and it does look like they've delivered on a whole number of fronts, with a whole bunch of things added into their designer's commentary documents. 10th edition has needed some rules clarifications for quite a while now. There's just been quite a lot of issues that I've mentioned in a few previous videos that have seen tournaments ruling in different ways to each other because the intent is either just not really clear or rules as written seems to contradict what looks like is intended, and sometimes it's possible to argue dodgy readings of rules if you want to. I feel like Games Workshop's really done well with this. They've fixed a whole bunch of issues. In my opinion at least, a fair few of them didn't really hugely matter which way they decided to rule the particular conflict. All that mattered was that they did come out with an official ruling so that everyone was playing on the same page and no one was going to be surprised or trying to have a very different rules interpretation of what other people might be playing on the other side of the table. The changes here were found in their designer's commentary document, the one that you can download alongside the Minotaur and Field manual and the balanced data slate that was updated on the 30th. Though I feel like the designer's commentary is a bit of a weird name for it, it's a bit of a hodgepodge of different things. There's some just actual core rules that probably should have been in the main core rules, but they don't want to change that document so everything looks the same as the printed book. Things like the way that certain units move or certain units can fight in and or out of combat. There's a whole bunch of definitions like an appendix, perhaps just to resolve any disputes as to exactly what they mean when they're talking about certain terms. And also it seems to be the place that they go for FAQs and errata, things that just aren't particularly common to come up in game and are more the case of niche rules interacting in one way or another. So a lot of stuff that's a bit more dependent on the datasheets than on the core rules itself. Overall, it does unfortunately mean that it's really quite a bloated document. I wouldn't really like to be a new player and just trying to come into that and process the entire document. I feel like most people out there generally tend to just get the gist of these rules changes via word of mouth, and it more spreads to people knowing how to play it as they play more and more games. I feel like there's probably pros and cons to the way that they do it. Maybe short and sweet FAQs would be a little bit more simple, ask a question then give some basic yes or no answers. But doing it this way in theory means they might have less to sort in the future, given that they're giving a more general answer to these rules queries that might crop up in future codexes. In any case though, let's go through these one by one and talk through the major changes to the core 40k rules. First up, there's transports and embarked units. This one was one that was debated, and I'd honestly have seen more people ruling that transported units couldn't disembark after the transport had come in from reserve, but it looks like Games Workshop have unambiguously ruled that you can. Units embarked within a reserves model can disembark on the turn that the model is set up, and when they're set up, they can't be set up anywhere within 9 inches horizontally of one or more enemy units. That will be relevant for things that are meant to drop things after coming in from reserve, like drop pods and things. The units count as having made a normal move, much in the same way that you would with reserve units or transported units normally, so no real surprise there. Though perhaps the bigger surprise is that the unit can't declare a charge this turn, I guess because the vehicle counts as having made a normal move, so it sort of feels like the vehicle is moving and then dropping the unit. So it means that if you use, say, a Falcon Grav tank to drop off some Howling Banshees or something, they wouldn't be able to attempt to charge on the enemy, so it's going to be a lot more useful for shooting units. This does actually seem like a fairly big nerf to things like the drop pod. Previously you could have at least threatened to try and make a charge on the enemy, but now it's completely forbidden. Looks like those sort of reserved units will only be useful for shooting things, not melee things. Next up is perhaps a slightly surprising change to one-shot weapons and the firing deck. This was a rules loophole that Games Workshop really needed to close. Technically you could use the firing deck keywords to get multiple rounds of shooting out of one-shot weapons, given that the firing deck means that the vehicle counts as being equipped with the weapons, not the squad within. So it meant that when the vehicle shot with those weapons, it'd use up any of its own supply of those weapons, but the squad inside wouldn't technically have fired anything. That was kind of obviously not intended. If you've got a one-shot bomb, then it shouldn't really matter whether or not it's the transport or the model inside that's firing it. But the fix with this was perhaps a little bit bizarre. rather than just saying that if you fire a one-shot weapon with a transport, it uses up one of those weapons for the squad within. They just say that you can't fire these weapons out of an open-topped firing deck now. Perhaps not the best use for Genestealer cults who might like to be chucking demo charges out of Goliath trucks. I guess that's one way of putting the issue to rest, but feels like it would have just been the more intuitive way just to say it uses up one of the squad supply of those weapons. Another really quite big one is clarifying that redeploy works with infiltrators. This was somewhat debated, and I certainly saw some tournaments ruling it different ways. The question being that when you have a character that allows you to redeploy X units, say moving them around on the board or putting them in strategic reserve, can they make use of special deployment rules like infiltrators? And Games Workshop says yes, you can. This one's genuinely really quite a big deal for the units affected. Infiltrators are pretty much the exact units that you want to redeploy if you could, as being able to move around and get perfect knowledge of where your opponent's setting up and then putting them down in the right place is really nice. You could potentially try and put them in an area where your opponent won't be able to damage them too much turn 1, but if you get at turn 1 they might be able to move and shoot and perhaps do a charge. This may be particularly powerful for the Space Marine Phobos captain, who specifically says that his redeploys happen after first turn is known. It means that you could literally have a bunch of scouts starting on the absolute front lines to make a nuisance of themselves charging the enemy, and then if the opponent gets first turn, you could just redeploy them all backwards, either put them in strategic reserve or hide out of line of sight on the midfield objectives. Next up, there's a couple of clarifications to Battleshock, mainly revolving around how they work with certain destroyed units, and this one basically amounts to being a nerf for certain respawn mechanics, perhaps most notably the Astra Militarum reinforcements, but I believe it will be relevant for things like the Tyrannid's Unending Swarm as well. Basically, if a unit gets destroyed, then if it was battle-shocked before, it still counts as battle-shocked for the purposes of any stratagems you might use on it just after it was destroyed. And that'll prevent you from using the reinforcement stratagem on destroyed units for the guard that were battle-shocked, so you wouldn't be able to just return those to reserve to come back next turn. I'd say that that's the biggest change, otherwise there's just a few more obvious clarifications, like you can't battle-shock destroyed units, and you can't use a test below full strength rule to force a double test on units that were below half strength and would have been testing anyway. That did seem to me like it was intended just to be an expansion of the normal battle-shock rule as opposed to in addition. They've made a clarification to vehicles and transports with bases. Usually Games Workshop says that if you've got a base you usually measure to that base, but the actual physical profile of the vehicle can be a bit prohibitive if it's really quite a big vehicle and the base is quite small. Say for example Drukhari Raiders. It means that you don't have to measure to within 3 inches of the base of the Raider, you can measure to just below 3 inches of any point on the model, which is perhaps particularly big for Drukhari things with the big spindly prongs and things pushing out on all sides. They just clarify the transport rules to use that ruling as opposed to many vehicles that use the hull. I feel like that's sensible enough, really. There's a couple of clarifications to units that count as making a normal move, so things that either come in from reserves or getting out of transports would be the most normal ones. The question here was if they count as making a normal move, do they trigger certain unit abilities or stratagems and things that might trigger when an enemy unit finishes a normal move? Say for example the reactive movement of a Termagant squad, would they be able to skitter away from the enemy jumping out of a transport? It seems that the way that Games Workshop have ruled this is that while they count as making a normal move for themselves, there isn't actually any point where they do make a normal move on the table so it doesn't trigger those kind of abilities, though it still doesn't stop them being an eligible target for Overwatch for the common reserves and transport type things, as that one also triggers if a unit's set up on the battlefield, and that could be via either of those things. Next up, another one that people have been debating really quite a lot was the ruling on ignores modifiers, relevant for a few big units like Mortarion, Trajan Valoris, or plenty of enhancements out there. Some things that say they just get the unit to ignore modifiers might be very specific about, say, hit rolls or wound rolls, but other things just say that you can ignore any modifiers to the hit rolls, wound rolls, or characteristics of the model. And the way that characteristics versus attacks are worded, there was some genuine debate as to whether or not it would count for things like AP or damage after the model has made an attack. It seems that Games Workshop has chosen to go for the more powerful of the possible rulings, and clarified that it does include things like damage modifiers, so things like Mortarion's attack would ignore things that have -1 damage, and it also works on AP modifiers, so they will be able to ignore things like Armour of Contempt, which worsens the AP of an attack, so there wouldn't be any point in using that particular stratagem against it. Quite nice to have that a bit more settled either way, as I feel like the previous designer's commentary actually made it more confusing if anything. Overall, models with that ability probably gained a little bit of power there. There was a small clarification to setting up added models to a unit. This one's something that can be done for quite a lot of reasons, like apothecaries or respawning models like Necrons or accursed cultists. One rule that I didn't actually realise was here in the designer's commentary is already that you have to set up new models within coherency of things that were already on the table at the start of the phase, so no chaining out these miniatures to greater lengths to snag an objective or make a very short charge or something like that. They have to be within coherency of things that were already there, and I think that does make a lot of sense. The only actual apparent change this time round is they added small clarifications to this for units that aren't on the board, such as Necrons in Hypercrypt, saying that they can still get models restored to the unit even if they're not there right now. That does kind of make sense, as Necrons have a stratagem to allow you to use reanimation protocols in Hypercrypt. It'd be kind of useless to be able to do that with Warriors or Immortals if you couldn't actually restore models. Otherwise, one kind of curious one is abilities of the same name apparently do stack unless they're one of the many exceptions. This one does feel a bit counterintuitive, given that in Warhammer 40k generally most special rules that give you abilities are generally worded in the sort of way that means that they don't stack for one reason or another. There's quite a few exceptions. Things like aura abilities specifically don't stack with each other if it's the same copy of the same rule, and otherwise things that grant a state, such as say suppressed for the Space Marine suppressors, means that a unit can't be suppressed more than once by two different units. I guess that kind of makes sense. For a fair few things that modify the hit roll or the wound roll, then you might well be capped out at a modifier of +1 or -1, just for the ways that modifiers work as per the core rules as well. So again, that would remove a lot of other things that could stack. Otherwise though, interestingly enough, it seems that the ruling here is that if you do have multiple copies of the same ability on say two different models, and there's no reason that they can't be cumulative, then apparently they potentially do. They gave the example here of the Great Unclean one, who's got a focus ability that reduces an enemy toughness by 1. They specifically call that out as that does stack, so if you had two Great Unclean ones and you both focus their ability on one target, you could maybe make a Space Marine Intercessor squad go all the way down to toughness 2, given that toughness modifiers aren't capped like hit roll or wound roll ones. Kind of an interesting decision here. I guess that could be potentially relevant for multiple Battleshock debuffs as well, if you had multiple copies that gave you a -1 leadership. I feel like if you get multi-stacking abilities like this, you might get unintended consequences out of running several units nearby, though I guess they tend to be kind of edge case, and most things tend to fall into the above exceptions. Another issue that I'm kind of glad that they put to bed was the sort of dodgy rules as written argument that said if you had a character such as Marnius Calgar or Lord Solar Leontus who generated command points during the command phase as part of their datasheet ability, that wouldn't count towards the 1 command point generation limits that you get for your army for the battle round, just due to the side text in the command phase section that seemed pretty clearly to be applying to the standard command points generation that you get each turn. Though I could see how you could make the argument. I feel like a quick negative for this one is probably helpful enough though, certainly puts that argument to bed, and people can point at this one as a clear ruling that those abilities do count towards your once per battle round command point limit. It seems that they've added a fair bit of wordiness to the command point reroll and rapid ingress via the designer's commentary. I can't help but think it's maybe a bit unhelpful to have some of the core stratagems have additions made to them in the balance status slate and some in the designer's commentary. Really quite silly that you now theoretically need 3 different documents to access the standard core stratagem set, as they don't seem to want to update the standard publication that came out at the start of 10th. The changes here are kind of in name only really. I don't think that people will play them differently. The command point reroll now clearly states that it targets the units that you use the command point reroll for, and that means that it's just a bit more clear that it does indeed work for things like free battle tactics, or for enemy units that might try and increase the cost of stratagems like the Hazardous Assassin or the Swarm Lord. Technically, I think that already had been answered via other designers' commentary, though it wasn't very obvious. Definitely handy to put it with the actual command point reroll rule. Otherwise, for rapid ingress, they just underline that if you have the deep strike keyword, then you can indeed use deep strike when you use rapid ingress. Again, that was one that basically everyone was playing that way anyway. I think it might have been trying to skirt a technicality with when deep strike happens as per that rule. But in any case, maybe not the worst to underline that it does work that way for newer players. Another small one for some interactions is just clarifying what counts as a modifier. Say for example, a modified damage characteristic could be affected by a -1 damage result of the enemy unit, or perhaps have the melter keyword where you get the +2 as a modifier. They just wanted to make it clear though that the actual number on the damage output, where it's something like d6 plus 1 for a las cannon, that bit doesn't count as a modifier. That's just literally the damage characteristic itself, and it just hasn't been determined yet. And it is important for a few interactions. Say for example, if you had an ability that made one failed save damage 0, if this did count as a modifier, then you still get 1 damage out of a las cannon, as you do out of a melter weapon within melter range. That'll give you 2 damage for plenty of units. And again, I feel like this was something that people were playing, but again means that there's no room for debate now. Lastly, for a more major one, there's one about redeploying units via strategic reserve in Battle Round 1. A few things scattered throughout the indexes have rules where you might be deploying a unit from reserve round 1 via one means or another. In quite a lot of those rules, it does give you the actual rules for how they get to set up. Say with things like the Raven Wing or Storm Lance detachments, their enhancements allow you to treat the battle round as one later for strategic reserve. So say if you came in battle round 1, then you'd be able to treat it as battle round 2, and that'll give you the locations where you could set up. Some unit rules do seem to be missing like this though. I think one example is the Necron Night Scythe. This one has a rule that allows it to come in from reserve on battle round 1, but technically there's no rule that states where it's allowed to come in from strategic reserve there. Although I feel like most people would probably say that you wouldn't come in the opponent's deployment zone as per Battle Round 2. Games Workshop have just clarified that that is the case, basically giving you the locations for where the Night Scythe will be able to set up, as per standard strategic reserve rules. Finally, for the bigger things, there's a big clarification as to the Hazardous rules, which is quite a meaty paragraph. It's maybe a little bit of an edge case for characters and vehicles, where they have the opportunity where if they fail a Hazardous roll, they might take 3 mortal wounds. And they basically just give you the sequence of events for running hazardous checks for models in the unit and how those mortal wounds are handed out. Perhaps the biggest upshot being that if you take a bunch of mortal wounds on a character, they can splash to the rest of the squad, or if it's a vehicle, to other vehicles in that unit. There might be a bit more to that I've not really understood. I guess the subtleties of it could be kind of important for big units like Crisis battlesuits with loads of cyclic ion blasters backed up by a commander. Finally, just to run through a few more things that I feel like maybe aren't quite as high importance. Charge bonuses that you get from other things like Blood Angels +1 attack and +2 strength on the charge isn't counted as part of your charge bonus if that happens to be denied or anything like that. Might be meaningful for things like Heroic Intervention. They more explicitly lay out the way that you test when objectives are controlled by your units, both saying that it's at the end of each phase and also the end of each turn. I guess it could potentially be a bit different if there's any abilities or shenanigans that happen at the end of the turn, which I guess might be technically after the end of the fight phase. There's a rule that says that you can't stack auto advance and treat movement as X type rules. I feel like it would have been a tenuous argument to say that you could in the first place. If you did happen to have 2 copies of those kind of rare rules, apparently you could do that with the Necron Overlord with Translocation Shroud and a Hypercrypt enhancement. I don't think I would have played them stacking before though. They say that enhancements must have a dedicated bearer if a character unit has multiple models and can take the enhancements. I guess that seems reasonable enough. And in a bit of a weird and common sense sort of one, you're not allowed to split units multiple times with things like transport vehicles. Say a Drukhari Venom can split Cabalite Warriors in half. You can't then continue to split the Cabalite Warriors into further Venoms with making very tiny units. I'm not sure anyone sensible was really trying to do that though. Overall, a fair bit of FAQ content and clarifications there. I feel like it's nice that Games Workshop have actually made an effort to address these, as there'd been a bit of a wait for them to get proper answers. Things like transports and reserves, the one-shot weapons thing, redeploys and infiltrators, and the counting as making a normal move thing are all really nice issues that seem to be resolved now. Let me know if you think that there's any other things that they've missed out with rules technicalities that they could have used with answering though. In any case, hope you've enjoyed the video, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd just like to help support, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down below in the video description if you'd like to check that out and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.